My wife mocked my late mother's jewelry and pawned it for cash, so I ended the marriage and made sure she couldn't afford. On her own reflection, I'm a 31-year-old guy. And when I married Julia, I thought I'd found my forever. From the moment we met, she seemed like the missing piece I'd been searching for, charming, ambitious, and endlessly captivating. I was drawn to her confidence, the way she carried herself, as if the world existed to notice her. I thought I was lucky, the kind of lucky where the universe smiles at you for once. Little did I know how wrong I'd be. I come from a family that values tradition. My father passed away when I was in my 20s, and my mother's memory has always been sacred to me. She handcrafted every piece of her jewelry, each one holding a story, a memory, a fragment of our family history. Growing up, I watched her treat her belongings with reverence, and I carried that lesson into adulthood. To me, family heirlooms weren't just objects, they were a legacy. And I expected Julia, someone I trusted with my life, to respect that. At first she admired the craftsmanship, the delicate engravings, the tiny imperfections that made every piece unique. But then came the offhand comments. "Why do you keep this stuff?" "It looks so old-fashioned," she said one evening, rolling her eyes at a silver bracelet engraved with my mother's initials. I laughed it off, assuming she was joking, but the tone had a sharp edge. A subtle dismissal I couldn't ignore. Our apartment reflected her tastes more than ours. Velvet cushions, shiny metallic finishes, extravagant artwork I didn't mind at first, swept away by her enthusiasm. But beneath it all, I started noticing a pattern. Sentiment meant less than luxury, tradition less than trend. My mother's jewelry sat on a velvet tray in the corner, and every time Julia passed by, I caught her lingering a bit too long, fingers brushing over necklaces and rings with an intensity that made me uneasy. That night, as she stood by the display, adjusting her hair and smiling at a piece as if it were hers already, I felt the first ripple of unease. Something about the way she looked at my mother's jewelry didn't sit right with me. I shrugged it off, telling myself I was imagining things. But the feeling lingered, heavy and insistent. Like a shadow waiting to stretch, I started noticing the little things soon after the subtle dismissals. The quiet undermining that I had once chalked up to personality quirks. Julia would sigh loudly when I mentioned family dinners, or brush off a story about my mother's old recipes with a casual, "Does anyone actually eat that anymore?" At first, I laughed it off, thinking I was just being sensitive. But there was a pattern forming, a slow, insidious weight that began to press on the edges of our marriage. One Saturday morning, I was polishing my mother's silver locket, a piece she wore every day until she passed, when Julia wandered into the living room, humming some pop song, and plopped herself on the couch with a disinterested flop. "Why do you care so much about this stuff?" she asked, waving vaguely at the locket. "It's just old jewelry. No one else is going to care about it." Her voice was light, teasing, but there was a sharpness underneath that made my stomach twist. I tried to explain that it was my mother's, that it carried memories, that it meant something. She rolled her eyes and muttered something about stuck in the past. It wasn't just the jewelry, though. It was the way she constantly compared our life to her standards of luxury. Expensive handbags over family photos, glossy magazines over framed memories, a new gadget over heartfelt gestures. Slowly, I began to feel like I was losing our shared world, that the values I had carried with me my entire life were quietly being replaced. Friends started noticing too. One of them, casually sipping coffee at our last dinner gathering, remarked, "She seems intense about things, doesn't she?" I laughed nervously, brushing it off. "She's just ambitious," I said. But the truth was, it wasn't ambition, it was a quiet, creeping disregard for anything that mattered to me, for the things I held sacred. Then came the moment that really started to gnaw at me. I caught her eyeing my mother's jewelry again, lingering over the gold necklace with tiny engraved flowers, holding it delicately in her fingers like it was a toy. She smiled in a way that made my skin crawl. Pride, curiosity, maybe even a little hunger. I didn't say anything, but inside, a cold knot began to form. Something about the way she looked at those pieces told me this was no longer just casual teasing. Something was coming, and I wasn't sure I was ready for it. It all hit me like a punch the day I found out what she had done. I was in the bedroom organizing a box of my mother's jewelry when I noticed one of the pieces, a delicate gold bracelet with tiny engraved stars, was missing. My heart skipped. I retraced my steps, checking every drawer, every hidden nook. Then I saw the small, crumpled receipt on the nightstand, half hidden under a magazine. My hands trembled as I read it. It was a pawn slip. Julia had pawned it. When she walked in, humming like nothing was wrong, I held up the slip, my voice shaking. "Julia, did you?" She froze just for a moment, before her face smoothed into that practiced calm. "Relax," she said, brushing past me. "It's just some old jewelry. It's not like it mattered." So the words hit me like ice. "Not like it mattered?" I asked, incredulous, my throat tight. "That was my mother's bracelet. You pawned it without even asking me?" She shrugged, almost casual. "It's not sentimental. I thought we could use the money for something fun. You're so attached to things from the past. Why are you making this a big deal?" Her tone was light, but it carried a sharp edge that cut deeper than any knife. I wanted to scream, to throw something, but the shock left me frozen. How could someone I loved, someone I trusted with everything, treat my family's memory like disposable clutter? I spent the rest of the evening in a fog. The apartment felt colder somehow, the walls closing in. The sunlight streaming through the blinds did nothing to warm me. I could hear Julia moving around, singing softly, as if the betrayal she had just committed were nothing more than a casual errand. The contrast between her carefree attitude and the weight in my chest was unbearable. By bedtime, I realized something frightening. This wasn't a one-time mistake. The way she smiled, the way she lingered near my mother's remaining pieces. The offhand comments about old-fashioned jewelry, it all suddenly made sense. She wasn't careless. She was deliberate. And that thought, the realization that someone you invite into your life could disrespect everything you hold sacred, left me staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep, wondering how far this would go after that day. The tension in our apartment became almost unbearable. Every time Julia walked past my mother's remaining jewelry, I felt my stomach tighten. She would casually comment on pieces, holding them up as if inspecting merchandise, turning them in her fingers and muttering things like, "This could fetch a decent price." I tried to convince myself I was being paranoid, that maybe she was just curious or clumsy. But the undertone in her voice, the way she smirked when she spoke, told me otherwise. It was deliberate. I began documenting everything, almost instinctively. I started keeping receipts, photographing the jewelry, even noting down casual comments she made about it. I didn't know exactly why I was doing it, maybe just to protect myself. Maybe to preserve my mother's legacy, or maybe because a small, nagging part of me knew this was only the beginning of something worse. I felt trapped in my own home. Every room now a minefield where anything could disappear at any moment. It wasn't just about the jewelry anymore, though that was the spark that ignited everything. Julia had started to subtly mock other parts of my life, to my family traditions, my modest tastes, the way I valued simple, meaningful things over shiny, expensive objects. One evening I made her dinner, a recipe my mother had passed down, and she poked at it with a fork and said, "Is this really all we're eating? You know, we could do better." Her tone was so casual, so dismissive, but it cut deep. It felt like she was erasing not just my mother's legacy, but my own values, piece by piece. Friends started noticing the tension too. At one dinner, a close friend whispered, "She's intense, isn't she? About everything?" I laughed nervously, but the truth was creeping in. Julia's charm was cracking, revealing something darker beneath her need to control, to reshape the world around her to match her desires. And I realized, with a sinking feeling, that this wasn't a phase. It wasn't temporary. She was testing boundaries, seeing how far she could go. That night, I saw her again near the jewelry display. She held my mother's pearl necklace in her hand, turning it over with a smirk that made my blood run cold. "This would look amazing in my collection," she murmured, almost to herself. I froze, staring at her. and felt the first real pang of fear. Something was coming, and I had no idea how to stop it. That weekend, I discovered the full extent of what Julia had been doing, and it hit me like a freight train. I went to check on my mother's remaining jewelry piece. It's carefully stored in a velvet-lined box in the bedroom, and my heart sank. Several rings were missing, the delicate bracelets gone. It's a small gold pendant that had belonged to my grandmother no longer there. Panic surged through me as I rifled through drawers, checking every corner, every hiding spot, only to find more receipts tucked away, evidence that she had pawned or sold multiple items. My hands shook so badly I could barely hold the paper. When I confronted her, I was trembling, trying to keep my voice steady. "Julia, did you?" I held up one of the slips like a warning, the ink barely legible. She looked up at me with that practiced calm, tilting her head. "Relax," she said, brushing past me, her tone like I was overreacting. "They're just things. You're making a mountain out of a molehill." My chest tightened, rage mixing with disbelief. "They're my mother's, Julia. You can't just sell them?" She laughed softly, a dismissive, almost cruel sound. "Your mother wouldn't care. You're too sentimental. Besides, you're always working, always stressing. Why should I respect your memories when they don't help me live now?" The words hit me like glass shattering in my chest. I wanted to scream, to shake her until she understood, but the shock and hurt left me paralyzed. My mother's legacy, something sacred, had been violated, and Julia treated it like play money. I spent the rest of the day in a haze, wandering from room to room, staring at the empty spaces where treasured pieces had sat. The apartment felt colder, the light harsher, the shadows longer. Every hum of traffic outside, every creak of the floorboards, felt like a reminder that my world was no longer safe. I realized then that this wasn't just about jewelry, it was about control, its power, and a deep disrespect for everything I held dear. By nightfall, I was consumed by a mix of anger, sorrow, and fear. Julia moved around the apartment, humming a tune, completely unaware of what, perhaps unconcerned with the storm raging inside me. And in that moment, I knew with terrifying clarity this was only the beginning. Whatever I thought our marriage was, whatever trust I had, was unraveling, and I had no idea how far she would go next. After the full scope of her betrayal hit me, I realized I had to act, but I didn't yet know how. That night, lying awake in the dark, I replayed every interaction. Every casual comment she had made about old-fashioned things, every smirk while handling my mother's jewelry, it all clicked. This wasn't accidental. Julia had been testing boundaries, seeing how far she could push me, and now she'd crossed a line I couldn't ignore. I felt a strange mixture of fear and fear of what she might do next. In clarity that I couldn't let this continue. The next morning, I started quietly taking control of the situation. I moved the remaining jewelry to a secure place, hidden from view, and began documenting everything. Pawn receipts, photos, dates, even the subtle ways she dismissed my feelings. I didn't confront her, yet she had to feel untouchable for the plan to work. Every time she passed by the display case, I caught her glancing over her shoulder, curiosity sharpening, her confidence unshaken. I could almost see her plotting, unaware that I was already 2 steps ahead. I also started auditing our finances discreetly. Joint accounts, credit cards, and bills all under scrutiny. I realized that if I didn't take these measures now, I might lose more than just sentimental items. The weight of it pressed down on me, but there was also a sense of empowerment in reclaiming a small corner of control. I could feel a shift inside Mitha. The fear was still there, but it was tempered with resolve. That week, Julia noticed the change. She made a passing comment, lightly mocking me. "You're awfully protective over a few old things. Relax a little." Just smiled, keeping my voice calm. "I'm just making sure everything's in order," I said. There was no hint of panic, no betrayal in my tone, but beneath it all, she felt the walls tightening. Even if she didn't fully understand how. That night, I watched her from across the room, turning over a pearl necklace, her fingers brushing it delicately. She smiled, confident as if she already owned it. I let the moment linger, silent, letting her believe she was in control. But deep down, I knew the tide was about to turn, and when it did, there would be no going back. The confrontation came sooner than I expected. I had been patient, documenting, securing, and strategizing. But one evening, Julia's casual arrogance pushed me over the edge. She was in the living room, swirling a wine glass and holding one of my mother's rings between her fingers, turning it over as if admiring a prize she'd won. "You know," she said, smirking, "this one could get a lot if I really needed cash." Her tone was light, teasing, but there was a sharp edge to it that made my blood run cold. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to remain calm. "Julia," I said slowly, "I need you to stop. All of it, the jewelry, the comments, everything." She laughed softly, almost mockingly. "Relax. You're so uptight about nothing. It's just a little fun. Besides, you're always working. You barely notice anyway." My jaw tightened. "It's not nothing," I said, my voice shaking slightly with anger. "These belong to my mother. You can't just treat them like toys or cash. This has to stop now." Her smile faltered, just a fraction, but she quickly masked it. "You're overreacting. Honestly, it's sad how sentimental you are. Maybe if you were more flexible, we wouldn't have this tension." I felt the familiar twist of disbelief and betrayal. Every word, every smirk, every casual dismissal I had endured them for months, letting her disrespect slide in the hope that she would change. But this moment crystallized everything. She wasn't going to change. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my shaking hands and pounding heart. "Julia, I'm done letting you walk over me. I'm done letting you disrespect my family, my home, and me." For the first time in weeks, I saw a flicker of uncertainty cross her face, but it was brief, replaced by defiance. She leaned back, crossing her arms. "And what are you going to do about it?" I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I let her feel the weight of my gaze, the resolve in my stance. The apartment felt heavier, charged, the hum of the refrigerator and the distant traffic outside suddenly suffocating. I realized then that this wasn't just a confrontation, it was the beginning of the end, and I was finally ready to take control. But even as I prepared to act, a cold knot of anticipation formed in my stomach. Julia was unpredictable, and I had no idea what she might try next. The days that followed were brutal. Julia didn't back down, in fact. She escalated. She started leaving passive-aggressive notes around the apartment, subtly mocking me for being too controlling or obsessed with old junk. One evening, I came home to find a small piece of my mother's jewelry missing again. This time a delicate brooch I had thought safely tucked away. Panic and anger collided, and for the first time, I felt genuinely powerless in my own home. She didn't even try to hide it. Later, I found the brooch in her handbag, a smug little smirk on her face as she toyed with it over dinner. "Relax," she said casually when I confronted her. "I just wanted to see if it would suit me. You're so tense about everything." Her words weren't just dismissive, they were taunting. I felt my chest tighten, every muscle screaming, but I forced myself to remain calm. Deep down, I realized this was psychological warfare. She wasn't merely disrespecting my mother's memory. She was testing me, probing for weakness. I started questioning everything: my judgment, my choices, even my sanity. Friends began noticing my quiet tension, asking if everything was okay. I nodded, forcing smiles, but inside I was unraveling. The apartment, which had once been a place of safety, now felt like a trap. Every creak in the floorboards, every shuffle of her heels, every casual hum from the kitchen reminded me that I was living in a minefield, where one misstep could cost me more than just sentimental items. By the end of that week, I hit my lowest point. I was exhausted, anxious, and emotionally drained. The betrayal cut deeper than I expected. It wasn't just theft. It was a violation of trust, of love, of family. I felt trapped, cornered, like a character in a story I didn't want to be part of. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat properly, couldn't think straight without picturing her holding, mocking and pawning what mattered most to me. And yet, amid the darkness, a small spark of clarity began to emerge. I realized that if I stayed passive, this cycle would never end. I couldn't change Julia, but I could change how this ended. I just had to plan carefully, wait for the right moment. I wasn't too late. The tension in the apartment had shifted. It was no longer just unease. It was a storm brewing, and I could feel it coming closer. By the time the following week rolled around, I knew I had to stop reacting emotionally and start acting strategically. I quietly went through our accounts, carefully noting any unexplained withdrawals or suspicious purchases. Every piece of documentation, every pawn receipt, every little smirk Julia had thrown my way over the past months suddenly became ammunition. I realized that this wasn't just about preserving my mother's jewelry anymore. It was about reclaiming control of my life and protecting what was mine. Julia noticed the shift almost immediately. She tried her usual casual teasing, saying things like, "You're really uptight about everything today. Lighten up a little." But her usual confidence was shaken just enough that I could see cracks forming. The same woman who had wielded my mother's jewelry like a weapon was now walking on a tighter wire. Cautious, testing to see how far I would go. I smiled inwardly, pretending to remain oblivious, while secretly tightening the leash. I started freezing joint accounts and redirecting assets to secure locations, making sure she couldn't touch anything without my knowledge. I also quietly gathered evidence of her pawn jewelry receipts and social interactions that highlighted her disregard for my family's legacy. Every move was calculated. Every interaction was a test. She tried small provocations, mocking a photo frame here, nudging a bracelet there, but I met them with calm resolve. I wasn't just defending my mother's memory. I was reclaiming my home, my dignity, and my peace of mind. The apartment felt different after that. The energy shifted, heavy but controlled, as if the power dynamics had quietly flipped. Julia's casual smirk faltered each time she passed by the secured jewelry display. For the first time, I realized that she was beginning to see me as someone she couldn't manipulate easily. And yet the tension was electric. Knew something was coming, though she couldn't quite grasp what. That night, I watched her again from across the room. She held a pearl necklace, turning it over, smiling like she had won some secret victory. But this time, I let her linger in her illusion of control. I didn't move, didn't speak, just watched. And deep down, I knew that when the storm finally broke, she wouldn't be prepared for what was coming next. The final confrontation was inevitable. I had waited, planned, and positioned myself carefully, and that evening, I decided it was time to make it unmistakably clear. This marriage was over. Julia was in the living room, idly flipping through a magazine while glancing over at my mother's secured jewelry display. I took a deep breath, my heart hammering, but my voice calm as I spoke. "Julia, we need to talk." Now. She looked up, a hint of irritation in her eyes. "About what?" she asked, tilting her head, trying to maintain that casual, untouchable demeanor. I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I stepped closer, letting the silence stretch. The weight in the room pressed down on her as she began to realize that I was no longer the passive, trusting partner she had manipulated for months. "This ends tonight," I said finally, my tone firm. "I've had enough of your games, your disrespect, and your theft. You're leaving, and nothing you've done will take that away." Her face shifted from smug confidence to panic, the first crack in the armor I had seen in months. She tried to bargain, to plead, her voice rising with desperation. "Wait, let's talk about this." I didn't mean I cut her off. "No, you've shown me who you are, and it's not someone I can live with. All of this, everything you've taken, everything you've disrespected, is done. I'm done letting you control my life." For a few tense moments, she stood frozen, her hands trembling as she realized the extent of her loss. The jewelry she had pawned, the assets she had tried to manipulate, the control she had wielded over my home, they were all beyond her reach. I had secured everything, documented everything, and positioned myself so that she could no longer cause harm or flaunt power over me. As I watched her slump into a chair, defeated and bewildered, a strange sense of calm washed over me. The apartment, once a battlefield, now felt like my own space again. I knew this was not just about revenge. It was about reclaiming dignity. It's about honoring my mother's legacy and finally putting an end to the toxic cycle. But even as I felt that first spark of peace, a quiet, reflective chill lingered. Julia had underestimated me, and I had ensured that she would never make that mistake again. The days after the confrontation were surreal. Julia retreated into herself, her confidence shattered, her usual bravado replaced with a shaky, uncertain silence. Friends and family began noticing the change too. People who had once admired her charisma now saw the cracks in her carefully constructed image. I felt a strange mix of vindication and exhaustion. Vindication, because justice, in its quiet form, had been served. And exhaustion, because the emotional toll of months of manipulation had left its mark. I spent most of that week reflecting on what had happened. I thought about my mother, about the jewelry that had meant so much, and about how I had let someone disrespect her memory for so long. I realized that protecting her legacy wasn't just about objects. It was about boundaries, self-respect, and knowing when to act. My actions had been measured, deliberate, and finally empowering. I had turned the situation around without stooping to chaos or revenge for the sake of rage. Julia tried to reach out a few times, her messages laced with feigned apology and regret. I ignored them, each unread text a small reminder that some people only understand consequences, not explanations. I reconnected with close friends and family, leaning on them for support and validation. Their encouragement reinforced what I already knew. I had done the right thing. I had stood firm, protected what mattered, and reclaimed my life. Even as the dust settled, I couldn't ignore the remnants of what had transpired. The apartment, once a place of fear and tension, was quiet again. I could move freely, breathe without the constant weight of scrutiny, and finally feel the sense of security I had lost months ago. But the memory of Julia's smirks, her subtle taunts, and her brazen audacity lingered, a cautionary echo of what I had endured. By the end of the week, I felt a renewed sense of self. I wasn't just a man who had defended his mother's legacy. I was someone who had learned the importance of boundaries, the necessity of standing firm, and the power of quiet, deliberate action. Julia had lost her control, and in that loss, I found clarity. And yet, as I sat in the stillness of my apartment, I couldn't help but wonder what would she do next, now that the game had ended. With Julia finally out of the picture, the apartment in tan, my life felt lighter, though the emotional scars remained. I spent the following weeks slowly reclaiming my home and my peace of mind. I organized my mother's remaining jewelry, carefully placing each piece in a secure, private spot, a silent tribute to the woman who had shaped so much of who I am. Every ring, every necklace, every bracelet felt like a victory, not over Julia, but over the violation of trust and disrespect I had endured for months. Began focusing on myself in ways I hadn't allowed before. Simple routines became rituals of healing, cooking meals that reminded me of my mother, walking through the park she loved, reconnecting with friends I'd neglected during the tension of the marriage. Each day, I felt a little more like myself again. The anger that had burned so fiercely began to cool, replaced by a quiet satisfaction in knowing I had handled the situation with patience, strategy, and dignity. Julia's downfall unfolded quietly but undeniably. Friends and acquaintances, who had once been charmed by her, discovered the truth of her actions, the pawned jewelry, the manipulations, the subtle cruelties she had inflicted. Her social standing faltered, her financial moves were blocked, and the control she had once wielded so effortlessly over my life slipped entirely from her grasp. She had underestimated me. That miscalculation ensured she would never be able to wield power over me or my family's legacy again. Looking back, the experience taught me the value of boundaries, vigilance, and self-respect. It showed me that love and trust should never come at the expense of one's dignity or family heritage. I found empowerment not in revenge, but in reclaiming my life and safeguarding what mattered most. The apartment, once a battlefield, became a sanctuary, a space where my mother's memory could be honored without fear. I sometimes catch myself smiling at the display case, now untouched and respected. Each piece is a reminder that I survived betrayal, that I can protect what I cherish, that some lessons, though painful, forge strength that lasts a lifetime. I may have lost a wife, but I regained my life, my dignity, my mother's legacy. And my mother's legacy, and for the first time in months, I feel truly free.